When the Apostle Paul writes about the resurrection in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, he uses words that leave no room for weakness. He says the body is sown in corruption, but raised in incorruption, sown in dishonor, raised in glory, sown in weakness, raised in power. The promise of the resurrection is total, absolute restoration. Death is swallowed up. Decay is reversed. Every broken thing is made entirely whole. We imagine a body restored to an absolute, unblemished ideal, a state of being where nothing is fractured, and every trace of previous suffering is completely wiped away. Yet, when Jesus steps into the locked room in John chapter 20, something about his body breaks our assumptions of perfection. He has conquered the grave. He has defeated the final enemy of humanity. He possesses a glorified, incorruptible body that can move through locked doors and appear at will. He is no longer bound by the normal limitations of human frailty. But when he speaks to his disciples, he is not unblemished. He has scars, deep, visible, physical wounds from iron Roman nails, and his side still bears the wide mark of a Roman spear. This is a detail we are so used to reading that we often miss how deeply shocking it actually is. Most of the time, we assume the wounds are there simply because the crucifixion was so severe. We think of them as lingering trauma, like a natural human scar that has not quite had the time to fade. But in a resurrected, glorified, immortal body, nothing lingers by accident. Nothing happens by default. If Jesus could conquer the total molecular decay of physical death, he could certainly heal a puncture wound. If the Spirit of God could raise a man from a sealed stone tomb, he could have easily raised him with flawless, perfect skin. But he did not. The text tells us clearly that the wounds stayed. And this presents a profound theological question that we rarely slow down to ask. Why would a perfect resurrection include permanent scars? Why would the ultimate victory over death carry the very instruments of death directly into the new creation? To understand what the gospel writers are showing us, we have to stop looking at the wounds of Jesus as leftover damage from a brutal Friday afternoon. The wounds of Christ are not a failure to fully heal. They are not a limitation of his resurrected state. They are a revelation. In the ancient world, physical perfection was the absolute standard for anything considered divine. To the Greek and Roman mind, gods were supposed to be untouched, unblemished, and completely invulnerable. A god who suffered was considered foolish. A god who bled was a weak god. A god who carried permanent scars was a contradiction. But the God of the Bible does something completely unexpected. He takes the ugliest, most violent emblem of human hatred, the Roman execution stake, and he permanently attaches its marks to his own physical identity. This is the central tension of the post-resurrection story. Jesus does not hide what happened to him in the dark. He presents it in the light. He invites his closest friends to look at the torn flesh. He is showing them that his glorified state did not erase his suffering. It redeemed it. The scars are not just evidence that he died on a cross. They are the absolute proof that the one who holds all authority in heaven and on earth is the exact same one who allowed himself to be broken. But this raises another detail, one that brings us to a locked room, a grieving disciple, and a demand for physical proof. Because what if the scars were not just an identifier for the disciples, but a deliberate, eternal choice? We are in the Gospel of John, chapter 20. It is 8 days after the first Easter morning. The disciples are still behind locked doors. The mood is heavy, and Thomas is issuing a demand. He was not in the room when Jesus first appeared, and he refuses to accept the testimony of his friends. His condition for belief is entirely physical and intensely specific. He says, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." History has given him the title of Doubting Thomas. We often read this scene as a failure of faith, but Thomas is asking for something profound. In the ancient world, stories of spirits, visions, and apparitions were relatively common. A purely spiritual appearance would not have been entirely unthinkable to a first-century mind. But a bodily resurrection, where a brutally executed man returns to actual, physical life, was completely outside their categories. Thomas wants to know that this is not an illusion. He wants to know that the Jesus who conquered the grave is the exact same Jesus who died on the wood. He is demanding continuity. Think about it from his perspective. If a flawless, glowing, unblemished being appeared in the room, How would Thomas know for sure that this was his rabbi? How would he know it was the one who wept with them, suffered with them, and bled for them? Flawlessness could belong to an angel. Flawlessness could belong to a vision. But the wounds belonged only to Jesus of Nazareth. Suddenly, Jesus stands among them. The doors are still locked, but physical barriers no longer apply to his glorified body. He speaks a blessing of peace, and then he turns his attention directly to Thomas. Notice what Jesus does not do. He does not scold Thomas for wanting physical reality. He does not offer a philosophical argument about the nature of the afterlife to prove he is real. Instead, he offers his own torn flesh. He says, "Put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side." Jesus uses the very instruments of his execution as his ultimate, undeniable identification. The scars are the absolute proof that the one who holds eternal life is the exact same one who submitted to death. The cross and the empty tomb are not disconnected. The Christ of glory is the Jesus of Golgotha. This is a stunning reversal of how we understand trauma and healing. Usually, when someone survives a terrible injury, the scars are something to hide. They are reminders of vulnerability. They are reminders of the time the enemy won, even if just for a moment. But Jesus wears his scars as trophies. He does not hide the marks of the nails. He presents them as the definitive proof that death has been swallowed up in victory. The wounds are no longer bleeding. They are no longer causing pain, but they remain present, and they remain open enough to be touched. When Thomas sees this, his response is immediate. The text does not even say he reached out to touch them. The sheer sight of the wounded, resurrected God drops him to his knees, and he utters the highest confession of faith found in the entire Gospel of John. He says, "My Lord and my God." It is the physical wounds that push Thomas into absolute worship. But this moment in the upper room is doing more than just healing the doubt of one disciple. Jesus is making a statement that would shatter the cultural foundations of the first century, because Jesus was not just proving his identity to Thomas. By keeping his scars, he was completely overturning how the ancient world viewed the divine. Walk through the ruins of any ancient Greek or Roman city, and you will see the same image repeated in marble and bronze. Gods with flawless bodies, untouched skin, perfect proportions. To the ancient mind, the highest form of existence was complete immunity to pain. The philosophers believed that a true God could not be hurt. If a being could be subjected to pain or altered by suffering, that being was not truly divine. Divinity meant distance. It meant absolute invulnerability. Now, imagine the message the early Christians carried into that exact cultural landscape. They did not preach a glowing, untouchable deity of marble. They preached a God who allowed himself to be nailed to a Roman execution stake. And even more shockingly, they preached a resurrected God who chose to keep the scars of that execution forever. When the Apostle Paul writes his first letter to the Corinthians, he captures this cultural collision perfectly. He says the message of Christ crucified is a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to the Greeks. The word for foolishness in the original language does not just mean a silly idea. It means absurdity. It means something so completely backwards that it is deeply offensive to human logic. To a Greek philosopher, a wounded God was a logical impossibility. If he was God, he could not be wounded. If he was wounded, he could not be God. To a Roman citizen, the idea was even worse. Crucifixion was not just a painful death. It was the ultimate social erasure. It was the lowest, most degraded punishment the empire possessed. It was reserved almost entirely for slaves, violent rebels, and those without citizenship. A Roman citizen was legally exempt from being crucified, no matter what crime they committed. It was considered too shameful, too degrading, for civilized flesh. If a Roman soldier survived a fierce battle, he might display his combat wounds with immense pride. Those were marks of strength. Those were proof that he had fought and conquered. But the marks of a crucifixion? Those were marks of absolute defeat. They meant you had been stripped, humiliated, and crushed by the overwhelming power of the state. Yet, when Jesus rises from the grave, he does not erase the marks of the state. He keeps them. He takes the ultimate symbol of Roman shame and elevates it into the eternal symbol of divine glory. He proves that true power is not invulnerability. True power is not untouched marble. True power is the willingness to be pierced for the sake of another. By retaining the wounds, Jesus completely dismantled the ancient world's definition of strength. He revealed that the God of the universe is not distant, shielded, and immune to human suffering. He entered it. He absorbed it. He let the worst of human hatred tear his flesh, and he carried the memory of it into his resurrection. But to fully understand why Jesus kept these specific marks, we cannot only look at how it challenged the Roman world. We have to look backward. Because this physical reality was not just a reaction to Roman culture. It was the fulfillment of something much older. If we look deeper into the Hebrew scriptures, long before the Romans ever invented their brutal crosses, we find a steady, quiet pattern. There is an ancient theology of marks and covenant. A pattern where physical marks are used to prove an unbreakable promise. To understand the wounds of the resurrected Christ, we have to look at how God operates throughout the entire Hebrew Bible. When God makes a permanent promise, he establishes a covenant. And in the biblical pattern, a covenant always requires a visible mark. When God promises never to flood the earth again, he puts a mark in the sky, the rainbow. When he makes a covenant with Abraham, he requires a mark in the flesh, circumcision. When he spares the Israelites in Egypt, he requires a mark on the doorposts, the blood of the Passover lamb. A covenant without a sign is just a conversation. A true biblical promise is sealed with something physical. But as the history of the Old Testament unfolds, a tragic pattern emerges. Humanity constantly forgets the covenant. The marks are ignored. The promises are broken. By the time of the prophet Isaiah, the people of Israel are fractured, exiled, and exhausted. They feel completely abandoned. In Isaiah chapter 49, the people cry out, "The Lord has forsaken me. My Lord has forgotten me." God's response to this cry is one of the most striking moments in prophetic literature. He asks, "Can a mother forget the baby at her breast?" Even if she could forget, God says, "I will not forget you." And then he offers a vivid, startling image. In verse 16, God says, "See, I have engraved you on the palms of my hands." Let's look closely at that word, engraved. The underlying Hebrew word is chakak. It does not mean to write with ink. It does not mean to paint something on the surface that can eventually fade or be washed away. It means to cut into, to carve deeply, usually into stone or metal. It is the language of permanent, structural alteration. For hundreds of years, readers understood this as a beautiful, poetic metaphor. It was a way for the invisible God to say that his memory of his people was permanent. But when Jesus steps out of the tomb, the metaphor shatters into reality. The poetry becomes physical. When Jesus holds out his hands in the locked room, he is not merely proving that he survived Friday. He is revealing the literal, flesh and blood fulfillment of Isaiah chapter 49. The Roman soldiers thought they were executing a political threat. They did not know they were participating in a divine pattern. With iron nails, they were carving the permanent mark of the eternal covenant into the palms of God. Notice the profound reversal happening here. Under the old system, the physical mark of the covenant was often placed on the bodies of the people to prove their loyalty to God. But in the new covenant, the mark is placed on the body of God to prove his unwavering loyalty to his people. He does not demand that we carry the scars of our own redemption. He carries them for us. Because of the resurrection, the hands of God are no longer just a prophetic idea. They are real. They have texture. They have form. And they have deep, unerasable scars. The wounds of Jesus are the eternal proof that God cannot forget his people because he has permanently altered his own body to remember them. But the pattern does not stop in the upper room. If the story ended there, the scars would simply be a historical memorial, a beautiful reminder of a battle already won. But Jesus did not stay in Jerusalem. 40 days later, he ascended. He carried that exact, wounded, glorified body out of our visible world and into the unseen realm. And that means these wounds are doing more than just proving an ancient promise. They are doing something active, right now, in the very center of heaven. When Jesus ascends into heaven in the first chapter of Acts, a cloud hides him from the sight of the disciples. But we must be careful not to misunderstand what is happening in that moment. He does not leave his physical body behind. He does not shed his humanity like an old coat the moment he returns to the spiritual realm. The incarnation was not a temporary disguise. When God became flesh, he became flesh forever. This means that right now, at the right hand of God, there is a human being, a human being with scars. But this raises a crucial question. If the work of the cross is entirely finished, as Jesus himself declared, why keep the visible evidence of the trauma? If the debt is paid, why hold on to the receipt? The writer of Hebrews gives us the key. To understand what Jesus is doing right now, we have to look back at the Old Covenant temple system. In ancient Israel, the high priest had one primary essential task on the Day of Atonement. Once a year, he would pull back the heavy veil and step into the Holy of Holies. He stood in the direct, localized presence of God to make an intercession for the sins of the entire nation. But the high priest could never walk into that room empty-handed. He had to carry the blood of a sacrificed animal. The blood was the physical evidence that a life had been given. It was the proof that the cost of rebellion had been covered. But there was a deep limitation to the old system. It was strictly temporary. The year passed. The people failed again. And 12 months later, a new priest had to bring new evidence into the room all over again. The writer of Hebrews tells us that the earthly temple was only a shadow. It was a rehearsal for the true reality. When Jesus ascended, he did not enter a temple built by human hands. He entered heaven itself. He stepped into the true Holy of Holies, not as a temporary priest, but as the final, eternal high priest. And like the priests before him, he did not go in without evidence, but he did not carry the blood of a goat or a lamb. He carried himself. He carried his own glorified, wounded body. The book of Hebrews, chapter 7, verse 25, says that Jesus always lives to intercede for us. The Apostle Paul echoes this heavily in Romans chapter 8, telling us that Christ is at the right hand of God, actively interceding on our behalf. We often imagine intercession as a constant conversation. We picture Jesus standing beside the Father, endlessly negotiating, begging him to forgive humanity one more time. But that is not what the biblical image suggests. Jesus does not have to plead with God to be merciful, because God is already completely merciful. The intercession is not a spoken argument. The intercession is his very presence. The scars are the intercession. When the justice of God looks at the sin of humanity, the wounds of Christ stand as the eternal, silent defense. They are the permanent proof of our redemption. They declare that the debt has been fully, finally, and forever paid. Every time humanity fails, the wounds are there. Every time the accuser points to our guilt, the wounds are there. They are not just historical markers of what happened on a Friday in Jerusalem. They are active, present, and continuously speaking grace into the throne room of the universe. They are the reason the veil stays torn. By keeping the scars, Jesus ensures that the evidence of his sacrifice will never fade and will never need to be repeated. But this understanding of his ongoing priesthood prepares us for something even more striking. Because decades after the ascension, the Apostle John is given a window into this exact throne room, and what he sees completely shatters our normal assumptions about the glory of heaven. Decades have passed since that Sunday evening in the locked room. The Apostle John is now an old man, exiled on the rocky island of Patmos, and he is given a vision that strips back the fabric of reality. In the book of Revelation, chapters 4 and 5, John is taken directly into the control room of the universe. He sees the throne of God. He describes a scene of absolute, overwhelming, untouchable power. Lightning, thunder, a sea of glass clear as crystal, creatures covered in eyes, constantly crying out about the holiness of the Almighty. It is a vision of divine supremacy that would have made perfect sense to the ancient world. Untouchable glory, unapproachable light. But then, a crisis happens in heaven. There is a scroll that holds the purposes of God, sealed with 7 seals. A mighty angel asks who is worthy to break the seals and open the scroll. And for a terrifying moment, the answer is no one. No one in heaven. No one on earth. No one under the earth. John begins to weep bitterly because no one is found worthy. Then, one of the elders surrounding the throne speaks to him. The elder says, "Do not weep. See, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David, has triumphed. He is able to open the scroll." John hears the announcement of a conqueror. He expects to turn around and see a predator, an apex symbol of violence, power, and dominance. A roaring lion, perfectly matching the majestic, terrifying throne room he has just described. But when John turns to look at the center of the throne, the image completely inverts. He does not see a lion. He does not see a glowing, flawless, unblemished Greco-Roman deity. Verse 6 gives us one of the most staggering sentences in the entire Bible. John says, "I saw a lamb, looking as if it had been slain, standing at the center of the throne." Let that image settle. The Greek phrasing John uses for slain carries the severe meaning of being slaughtered, butchered, or violently sacrificed. He sees a lamb bearing the physical, visible marks of a violent death. And this lamb is not standing off to the side. He is not a secondary character in the throne room. He is standing at the exact geometric center of all heavenly authority. The elder promised a lion. John saw a wounded lamb. And heaven does not see this as a contradiction. In the economy of God, the ultimate expression of power is suffering love. The highest revelation of the glory of God is not his ability to crush his enemies, but his willingness to absorb their violence and offer them grace. This changes everything about how we imagine eternity. When we picture the ascended, victorious Christ, we tend to picture a cosmic king who has completely left the cross behind. We think the crucifixion was just a necessary, ugly transition to get to the real glory. But Revelation chapter 5 dismantles that assumption. The wounds did not just survive the resurrection, they made it all the way to the throne. The scars are not a temporary phase. They are the permanent, eternal identity of the Son of God. For all of eternity, the physical memory of Golgotha will be the central focus of heavenly worship. God has forever bound his identity to the trauma he suffered for us. But this revelation brings the story directly into our own lives. Because if the glorified body of God is a wounded body, if the marks of the cross are eternal and not just a memory, what does that mean for the pain, the memories, and the scars we carry right now? We spend so much of our lives trying to hide our scars. We cover them up. We edit them out. Whether they are physical marks on our skin, deep emotional trauma, or the invisible wounds of grief and failure, we tend to view our scars in only one way. We see them as evidence of the worst days of our lives. They are the lingering proof of the time we were broken, the time we were betrayed, or the time we were simply not strong enough to stop the pain. The normal human assumption is that when God finally makes all things new, he will simply erase all of this. We imagine eternity as a giant reset button, a place where our histories are wiped completely blank, and we are handed a flawless, untouched existence as if the suffering of this world never actually happened. But the physical wounds of the resurrected Jesus challenge that assumption entirely. If the glorified body of God kept its scars, we have to rethink what redemption actually means. In his letter to the Philippians, chapter 3, verse 21, the Apostle Paul writes something that directly connects the body of Jesus to our own future. He says that the Lord Jesus Christ will transform our lowly bodies so that they will be like his glorious body. Notice the phrasing carefully. Paul does not say our bodies will be made perfect according to a human, untouchable standard. He says they will be made like his glorious body, and his glorious body is a wounded body. This tells us something profound about how God handles human brokenness. The theology of the resurrection is not a theology of erasure. It is a theology of redemption. God does not just sweep our suffering under the rug and pretend it never occurred. If he simply erased our history, it would mean that the enemy, the pain, and the trauma had the final word on those dark days, and God just had to build something brand new to replace it. But God does something far more powerful than replacing our past. He redeems it. He takes the very things that broke us. He removes the sting, he removes the shame, and he transforms them into testimonies of his grace. In 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 10, Paul says that we always carry around in our body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our body. Paul understood this deeply. He carried physical scars from being beaten, stoned, and imprisoned for the gospel, but he stopped seeing those marks as signs of his own weakness or defeat. He began to see them as the physical canvas where the resurrection life of Christ was being put on display. Because of the empty tomb, a scar is no longer a monument to the wound. It is a monument to the healing. It means the thing that tried to destroy you ultimately failed. The darkness did not win. Jesus did not let the Roman Empire dictate the eternal meaning of his pierced hands. He took the meaning back. He redefined the worst violence of the ancient world into the ultimate portrait of divine love. And because believers are united to him, he promises to do the exact same thing with our brokenness. He will not waste a single tear. He will not discard your history. He will heal you so completely that the pain is entirely gone, but the profound testimony of his rescue remains. When we finally understand this, it changes everything about how we look at our own struggles and how we look at the cross. But it also prepares us for one final, beautiful truth. A truth about what we will actually see and what we will actually touch when we finally step into the full reality of eternity. We have traveled from a locked room in Jerusalem to the very center of the throne of heaven. And as we step back and look at the whole picture, a profound realization begins to surface. We often talk about what will be in heaven. We imagine the brilliant light, the sea of glass, and the absolute restoration of all creation. We wonder what human things, if any, might cross over from this broken world into the eternal one. But there is a famous observation made by Christian thinkers over the centuries. When you look closely at the biblical picture of eternity, there are only certain man-made things that will last forever. The scars on the body of Jesus, the only human craft that survived the resurrection and ascended to the throne room, is the damage we inflicted upon our Creator. We built the cross. We forged the iron nails. We drove the spear. And God did not throw those things away. He took the absolute worst of human hatred, human rebellion, and human violence, and he absorbed it into his own flesh. He did not let the Roman Empire dictate the final meaning of those wounds. Instead of erasing the memory of what we did, he transformed it into the eternal monument of his grace. To the ancient Greek and Roman mind, this would always be foolishness. A wounded God was an absurdity. A God who held on to the marks of a crucifixion was considered weak and defeated. But the gospel reveals a truth that completely upends human wisdom. True power is not untouched marble. True power is a love that is willing to be pierced, and a life that is strong enough to swallow up death. This completely reshapes how we understand the nature of God. It is so easy to treat divine love as an abstract concept, a theological category, a distant, spiritual reality that exists somewhere in the heavens, far removed from the dirt, the tears, and the blood of actual human life. But the physical wounds of Christ tell us that the love of God is not an idea. It has texture. It has depth. It is permanently written into human flesh. When Thomas reached out his trembling hand in that locked room, he was not just touching a rabbi who had somehow survived the weekend. He was touching the ancient promise of Isaiah, literally engraved on the palms of God. When the writer of Hebrews tells us that Jesus always lives to intercede for us, he is not describing a courtroom where a lawyer is frantically making a spoken argument. He is describing a high priest whose very presence is the undeniable proof that the debt is entirely canceled. And when John looks into the throne room of the universe, he does not see a distant, shielded deity demanding our performance. He sees a lamb bearing the violent marks of sacrifice, standing at the absolute center of all authority. The resurrection was never just about reversing death. It was about redeeming everything that death touches. Jesus kept his scars to prove that human suffering is not the end of the story. Brokenness is not the final word. The worst moments of our history can be swallowed up by grace and turned into something glorious. If God can take the dark wood of a Roman cross and turn its marks into the centerpiece of heaven, then there is absolutely no part of your story that is beyond his redemption. If this journey through Scripture has helped you see the Bible with fresh eyes, consider subscribing to the channel so we can continue uncovering these patterns together. The physical wounds of Jesus were never just lingering damage from a Friday execution. They are the eternal, unbreakable proof that the God of the universe would rather bear our scars forever than spend eternity without us.